for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Okay, so I'm gonna try sharing my screen here. Can you give me a thumbs up or a yes or something if you can see the slides? Okay, great, great. So thank you all for making the time to come to this talk. I look forward to testing out these ideas that are sort of a work in progress and to getting your feedback. So to start, kind of my inspirations for this project, there were really two. One was the Supreme Court's holding in the 2018 case Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado. So this was the Supreme Court case. The basic question was, did a Colorado baker have a First Amendment right to refuse to make a wedding cake for a same-sex wedding? The court didn't really decide any of the pressing First Amendment questions about whether or not the baker had that right. What the court said instead was that there was sort of a procedural failure as to how Colorado adjudicated this case because Colorado exhibited hostility towards the baker's religious beliefs. And to exhibit hostility to someone's beliefs in this sort of governmental role violates the First Amendment. So that's the one inspiration for this project now, trying to sort out exactly what did the court mean when it said that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission exhibited hostility towards the baker's religious beliefs. And the second thing is what's being termed the conceptual engineering movement in academic philosophy. If you have no idea what the conceptual engineering movement in academic philosophy is, that's okay. We'll talk about it. So this is my plan for the next few minutes. First, I just want to explain what philosophers mean by conceptual engineering. Second, I'm going to argue that the Supreme Court justices have engaged in conceptual engineering over the meaning of hostility to religion, over the meaning of that term. And then third, I'm going to examine the pros and cons of various ways of conceptually engineering hostility to religion. So that's the plan. So let's start with what is conceptual engineering? Some roughly interchangeable terms would be conceptual engineering, conceptual ethics, and ameliorative projects. All these terms get used in the philosophical literature in roughly an interchangeable way. So these terms can all be contrasted with conceptual analysis. So conceptual analysis in 20th century analytic philosophy was this sort of key project of trying to figure out what our concepts and what our words mean. Conceptual engineering differs from conceptual analysis in the fact that it asks, what should our concepts mean, rather than what do they in fact currently mean? So that's kind of key difference, but I want to dig into this a little more. So the philosopher Herman Capellan up here, he describes conceptual engineering as the process of assessing and improving our representational devices. Similarly, Sally Haslinger describes ameliorative projects as attempts at enhancing our conceptual resources to serve our critically examined purposes. So as I said before, ameliorative projects, conceptual engineering, these sort of function as interchangeable terms in the philosophy literature. But of course, these definitions themselves have sort of terms that need unpacking. What's a representational device? A representational device is basically anything we use to sort of explain the world to ourselves. So this includes language, it also includes concepts, but it can even expand to things like ideology or narratives. You might also be wondering, what's a conceptual resource? It's something pretty similar. So conceptual resources, once again, we've got a set of interchangeable terms in the philosophy literature. Sometimes philosophers talk about conceptual resources. Sometimes they talk about epistemic resources. Sometimes they talk about interpretive resources. But these things all refer to interpretive devices, such as language, concepts, theories, narratives, that help us make sense of the world. So what is conceptual engineering? Conceptual engineering is the process of assessing and improving the things we use to try to understand the world. it doesn't just take our language and our concepts as given. Rather, it asks, what should our language mean? What should our concepts mean? So here's some examples of conceptual resources. So the philosopher Miranda Fricker up here talks about coinage of sexual harassment as the development of a conceptual resource. The idea is that we understood the world better and were able to more effectively navigate the world once we had this term coined. Crediting Alice Walker, the philosopher Brianna Toole cites colorism, defined as prejudicial or preferential treatment of same-race people based solely on their color. As a conceptual resource, this is Brianna Toole down here. Toole gives this as an example of how she understood her own experiences as a light-colored, light-skinned, biracial Black woman better after she had the concept of colorism. So notice here that both Toole and Fricker talk about language. They're talking about words or phrases, sexual harassment, colorism. I've generally put language inside the single quotes to mark language. And they're also talking about terms that were coined at some point specifically for the purposes of helping us illuminate our experiences. Here's two other examples. Kate Mann seeks to conceptually engineer the concept of misogyny in her book Down Girl. And Robin Dembroff has worked to engineer a revised concept of sexual orientation that is more inclusive of trans and non-binary people. Notice in both Mann and Dembroff's cases, what they're doing is talking about a concept, and I've generally put concepts in italics like this. They're also both referencing terms that have existed for a long time. They're not introducing new terms into the lexicon, like with sexual harassment or colorism. Rather, they're asking us to change how we understand concepts and words that already exist to better meet certain ends. So conceptual engineering is often done explicitly and consciously by philosophers. You know, they'll write a paper saying, I want to conceptually engineer the following concept. But conceptual engineering need not be either explicit or conscious. Some philosophers have advocated for being explicit when one conceptually engineers. Sally Haslanger is someone who has done this. And part of the motivation is, look, we want to be upfront with people about what we're doing. If we want to change the meaning of a term, we should come out and say, we want to change the meaning of a term for the following reasons. But others have suggested this is not always necessary or desirable. So for example, the philosopher Amiya Srinivasan has argued that sometimes feminist philosophy would be better off not being explicit about the engaging in conceptual engineering, doing it anyways, but not necessarily calling it that, seeking to influence the meaning of words without being explicit about doing so. So I suspect that judges and justices often engage in conceptual engineering in their opinions. You know, there's a piece of precedent, it's got some language in it that they want to use, but maybe the terms haven't been understood in the way that would be most favorable to them in the past. So what do? They conceptually engineer the term. They take the language, they plop it into a new case, but they sort of try to update what the words mean to better fit their purposes. Such engineering is usually implicit. If they're explicit about it, if they say, look, I'm trying to conceptually engineer this term, that's going to likely result in charges of judicial activism. So generally, judges and justices aren't going to want to be super explicit if they're conceptually engineering a term. But I do think it can be conscious or unconscious. I think sometimes when judges engage in conceptual engineering, they kind of know that's what they're doing, even if they don't call it that. They realize they're sort of shifting, changing, manipulating the meaning of a term or phrase. But other times I think it's unconscious. Just the words have been used in a certain way in the past. They bring their own perspective to the case and they sort of change the language as a result in the context of precedent. So I want to explore this idea with the court's jurisprudence about hostility to religion. So now let's go back to the masterpiece cake shop case. So here's the scenario. You've got a baker Jack Phillips. He was sued by a same-sex couple in Colorado for refusing to provide them with a wedding cake for their same-sex wedding. He was sued in Colorado under Colorado state law. Colorado sided with the same-sex couple, holding that Phillips had violated Colorado's Anti-Discrimination Act, which I'll just refer to as CADA from here on out. CADA protects against discrimination based on sexual orientation in places of public accommodation. So Phillips, the baker, argued that CADA, as applied to his case, violated his First Amendment freedoms of speech and religious free exercise. This case was taken up by both the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and the Colorado Court of Appeals. Both heard the case and disagreed with the baker, siding with the couple. So eventually, this case makes its way up to the Supreme Court on Appeal. So the sort of key question is, does CADA, as applied to the baker, violate the First Amendment? Well, the Supreme Court didn't really answer that question. What they said instead was that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission exhibited hostility towards the baker's religious beliefs. And since that violated the First Amendment, they were going to vacate these particular proceedings. So sort of annul Colorado's rulings in this case, but the vacating was based specifically on the behavior of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. They didn't say anything broader about the constitutionality of CADA. So just by reading the court's opinion, at least from my perspective, it's hard to tell exactly what the court thinks hostility to religion is. If you've got the background knowledge about previous cases, you can sort of figure it out pretty easily. But if you're just reading the opinion, it's not super obvious. Sometimes hostility to religion is equated with any form of negative non-neutrality toward religion. So any sort of unfavorable deviation from neutrality is treated as hostility to religion. Other times, the concept of hostility to religion is equated with more specific attitudes, like animosity or disrespect. So to sort of preview what I think the tension is here, if we're thinking about the ordinary language meaning of hostility, we don't normally think that all sorts of unfavorable deviations from neutrality count as instances of hostility. So it seems like we've got some sort of ambiguity going on here. If in one sense, you count as hostile to religion, if you're disfavorably non-neutral to religion. And in another sense, you've got to do something perhaps a bit more particular, like show animus or disrespect or animosity towards religion. So let's kind of take these concepts or these senses one at a time. Let's start with hostility as what I'm going to call negative non-neutrality. So the First Amendment requires the government to treat religion neutrally. That is, government should neither show favor nor disfavor to religion, either specific religions or no religion. From the mid-20th century onward, hostility toward religion was often treated as synonymous with failing to treat religion neutrally in a disfavoring way. So the shorthand I'm going to use is in this first sense of hostility to religion. It just means negative non-neutrality towards religion. It's any sort of failure to treat religion neutrally in a way that's negative, inhibiting, or disfavorable to religion. So here's just a couple examples from many that I could have chosen where the court sort of uses this language. The first quote, "The First Amendment leaves the government in a position not of hostility to religion, but of neutrality." So hostility is the contrast class from neutrality. Here's a second example. "The Establishment Clause mandates state neutrality not hostility toward religion. Another instance where, you've got the neutrality category and hostility is failure to be neutral. So hostility is normally not treated as mere non-neutrality in ordinary parlance. This goes back to the point I was making earlier. Normally we think of hostility as something more specific than just any sort of deviation from neutrality in a negative direction. So one might think defining hostility toward religion as meaning negative non-neutrality towards religion is a technical or stipulative definition. I think that's sort of right, but this definition isn't completely removed from ordinary meaning. There's some sort of connection between what we ordinarily mean by hostility and this more technical definition of hostility as negative non-neutrality toward religion. So I'm going to call this first sense a semi-stipulative meaning. It's somewhat stipulated. It doesn't just fit ordinary parlance, but it's not completely removed from it either. So defining hostility toward religion as negative non-neutrality towards religion is in essence definition by negation. What counts as being hostile towards religion? Well, failure to be neutral to religion in a negative sort of direction. So in order to understand hostility toward religion, you need to understand what neutrality is and what it means to fail to be neutral toward religion. And here, the justices have openly disagreed with one another over what counts as neutrality and failing to be neutral towards religion. So I'll give just one example. The 1989 case of Allegheny County versus ACLU. This was one of a number of cases over public religious displays. This was actually a consolidated case. You've got two different cases. One, you've got a nativity scene being displayed around Christmas on public land. The other one, you have a menorah and I forget what all the other things were, like a snowman, Santa, maybe also some sort of Christian religious symbols. Basically, in the one case, you had just an isolated Christian display. And in the second case, you had a bunch of sort of seasonal religious symbols and non-religious symbols together. So the court said, having just the nativity scene up, that's not okay. That looks like endorsing a specific sort of religion. But if you have religious elements and a larger sort of like seasonal display, that's fine. That's not unconstitutional. And these were both on public lands. So Justice Kennedy dissented in that case. He thought both displays should have been held as constitutional. And here's what he had to say about the court's decision that the one display was not constitutional. He writes, rather than requiring government to avoid any action that acknowledges or aids religion, the Establishment Clause permits government some latitude in recognizing and accommodating the central role religion plays in our society. Any approach less sensitive to our heritage would border on latent hostility toward religion. So see what's going on here. Typically, justices have been saying, look, hostility is negative non-neutrality towards religion. But what Kennedy does is offer a a more expansive conception of what counts as acting neutrally towards religion. His conception includes accommodating religion to a certain sort of extent, but he keeps the contrast class. He says any approach less sensitive to our heritage would border on latent hostility towards religion. So in essence, he's saying sometimes if you're not accommodating religion, then you're exhibiting latent hostility towards religion, or at least something really close to it. This met with a lot of backlash from the court at the time. So Justice Blackmun, writing for the majority, responds, although Justice Kennedy repeatedly accuses the court of harboring a latent hostility or callous indifference toward religion, nothing could be further from the truth. Justice Kennedy apparently has misperceived a respect for religious pluralism I think there might be a word here. Oh no, sorry, a respect commanded by the Constitution as hostility or indifference to religion. Sandra Day O'Connor, in her concurrence, writes, contrary to Justice Kennedy's assertions, neither the endorsement test nor its applications in these cases reflects an unjustified hostility toward religion. And Justice John Paul Stevens responded that the suggestion that the only alternative to governmental support of religion is governmental hostility to it represents a giant step backwards in our religious clause jurisprudence. So what's my basic point here of this case? It's that the justices are fighting amongst themselves as to what constitutes neutrality towards religion and hostility to religion. They're not just disagreeing about application of a particular case. They're disagreeing over what hostility toward religion is and what a failure to be neutral towards religion is. They're fighting about concepts to an extent, and by extension, they're also fighting about the meaning of words and phrases. So in more recent years, many justices have moved away. So sorry, that was what I had to say about hostility as negative non-neutrality. But I had said before in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, there seemed to be at least two senses of hostility. So now we're talking about that second sense, hostility, what I'm calling in an ordinary sense. I've written on this topic before, and originally I said something like this. Well, hostility has an ordinary meaning that the courts didn't use. I now think I was wrong because I think hostility is an ambiguous word, and I'll say more about that later. But for now, I want to talk about a second sense. So there's hostility in an ordinary sense. In more recent cases, many justices have moved away from a technical sense of hostility to religion and used the term closer to common parlance. So for example, in a 1993 case, the court equated hostility to religion with animosity. And in 1997 one, it compared hostility to religion with animus toward religion. And this has become more and more commonplace. Justices use words and phrases like hostility to religion interchangeably with words and phrases like showing animus towards religion, animosity towards religion, disrespect towards religion, ill will towards religion, things like that. And I think this is also a kind of conceptually engineering. It's moving the phrase away from its semi-stipulative meaning towards an ordinary language meaning. This sort of conceptual engineering might be unconscious. It could just be justices bringing their ordinary understandings of the word hostility to the cases. But I think it's conceptually engineering nonetheless. This has allowed justices to appeal to competing interpretations of hostility to religion in different cases, depending on their goals. This is the downside. Once a term is ambiguous and is ambiguous in precedent, you can pull from the precedent you like when you want the word to mean a certain sort of thing, and you don't pull from that precedent when you don't want it to mean that thing. So I think the result is a disorganized and sometimes inconsistent set of decisions made by not only the Supreme Court, but lower courts. Okay, so here's a final wrinkle that I want to bring in. In the 2019 decision, American Legion versus the American Humanist Association, the question the court had was whether or not a 90-foot cross on a World War I memorial on public land violated the First Amendment. Justice Alito, writing for the court, so the court decided no, it didn't violate the First Amendment. But here's the part of the decision I'm interested in for our purposes. Alito, writing for the court, implied that removing the cross would be inconsistent with the First Amendment because its removal would be seen by many not as a neutral act, but as the manifestation of a hostility towards religion that has no place in our Establishment Clause traditions. The key word, which I've bolded and italicized here, is the word seen. Justice Alito isn't talking about what in fact constitutes hostility to religion. He's talking about what someone might take to be hostility to religion, an appearance of hostility to religion. And this is a separate matter that we're going to treat separately in just a moment. Okay, so I've done the first two things here. Now, in the last little bit, in the last few minutes, I want to examine the pros and cons of various ways of conceptually engineering hostility to religion. So very briefly, I want to say something about the semantics of hostile. And I've switched the word hostile here because I think looking at that root word is a bit more useful for a point I want to make, and then thinking about the derivative words hostility later. So hostile appears to be a polysemous word. That is to say, it's a lexically ambiguous word with related senses, with related semantic meanings. To see this, think about the differences between the following phrases: a hostile interlocutor, a hostile work environment, and then a hostile environment generally. So I've got a desert here as an example of a hostile environment. We tend to explain what it means for an interlocutor to be hostile in terms of their attitudes, intentions, or behaviors. But we tend to explain what makes a natural environment hostile in terms of its lack of suitability for human survival or human flourishing. You can see the obvious connection between these two kinds of hostile, but I think they constitute two distinct but closely related semantic meanings. So how should these different meanings be thought about relating to one another? One possibility is that the word hostile has a single core underspecified meaning from which the various more particular different senses derive. This is a really common phenomenon with verbs, so things like make or cut, but this could be what's going on with hostile too. On this theory, then, if the word hostile is polysemous, the concept hostile might be an essentially contested concept. And I'm going to breeze over that for the sake of time, but we could talk about that later if you want. So what do these observations about hostile tell us about the meaning of hostility and hostility toward religion? Well, one thing it might tell us is that meaning might depend on the implied subject. Before, I've said that environments are hostile in a way different than conversational partners. So if we're trying to figure out the meaning of hostile or hostility, we might need to see who's being accused of being hostile or exhibiting hostility, who or what. Can a civil rights commission exhibit hostility to religion, even if none of its members do? If so, in which senses? So for the sake of time, I just want to hit to this last question. What should the court do? Here's a couple possibilities. One, the court could stipulate. The court could explicitly limit itself to the semi-stipulative definition of hostility to religion as negative non-neutrality toward religion. The pro of doing this is that it might avoid some ambiguity and confusion if the court was being explicit. But there are some cons. It's probably too late is one of the cons. The ship has sailed, so to speak. The term's been used in all sorts of different ways. You probably can't put it back to just a single univocal use now. Secondly, if you're using the phrase hostility towards religion in a semi-stipulative sense, you risk misleading the public. You know, when the case is being reported and people say the court concluded that so-and-so exhibited hostility toward religion, or such and such an entity exhibited hostility toward religion, people are going to infer some sort of ordinary language meaning about hostility in most cases, not some sort of stipulative definition. The second proposal, one could say the court could explicitly limit itself to the ordinary language meaning of hostility. A pro here, this could avoid misleading the public and avoid confusion and ambiguity in decisions. I think the downside now that I didn't see before is it's not clear this option is actually conceptually possible if hostile and hostility are polysemous. Before I thought like, look, there's sort of like one ordinary language sense. But I think this actually radically misdescribes the way in which there are a bunch of related ways in which words like hostile and hostility get used. So to just say, hey, use the ordinary language meaning sort of misunderstands the semantics of hostility. So I used to favor proposal 2. Now I'm not sure I do. Third thing the court could do, they could disambiguate distinct senses of hostility and hostility to religion and apply them in different cases. This could allow for more precision. They say, look, in this context, we're using the phrase hostility to religion this way. In this context, we use it in a different way. That could be usable. But this is no easy task. It really sort of deviates from how courts normally operate. I think judges like the way in which they can sort of keep their options open to use precedent in flexible ways by not distinguishing quite so clearly. Plus, it's just not an easy task. A fourth thing the court could do, and this option is actually compatible with any of the other theories I've put forward before. They could separate talk of appearances of hostility from actual hostility. So there's precedent for this kind of move. So in a certain line of cases, courts distinguish between corruption and the appearance of corruption. And they acknowledge this as two different things. So I have option 4 here because I'm particularly worried about what Alito did in the American Legion case by talking about how something might be seen as hostile to religion. The worry is, yes, audience A may see a certain action as hostile to religion, but audience B might see not engaging in that action as hostile to religion. So if we're going to use appearances of hostility to religion in making decisions, we need to make sure we're being fair and considering everyone's perspective, not just the perspective of some, which is, I think, something Alito failed to do in American Legion. And we can talk more about that if you'd like. So the court could define hostility towards religion as a state requiring certain objective intentions or actions while acknowledging the significance of appearances of religious hostility. That's one thing they could do. This might allow for more fair and accurate rulings. So for example, I sort of feel like the Colorado Civil Rights Commission were treated unfairly by being told they exhibited hostility to religion. I'm not sure they did, but the court could have said something that I think is more plausible. They created circumstances under which they might reasonably appear to have not been neutral to religion, and that could matter. So I think making that distinction could be useful. A downside of doing this may delegitimize a valid sense in which hostility is constituted by subjective experience. So it seems to me, if we think about like a hostile work environment, someone can rightly perceive that their work environment is hostile, even if no one in their work environment explicitly has animosity or ill will towards them. So I worry separating out appearances might legitimize or delegitimize certain readings of hostile and hostility on which subjective experience really matters and is in fact a constitutive factor. The fifth option, they could just stop using appeals to hostility toward religion and focus on less ambiguous language instead. So I don't think courts could do everything they're doing currently without ever mentioning the word hostility again. They could talk about negative non-neutrality towards religion. They've got other terms that they use there. They talk sometimes about inhibiting religion or disfavoring religion. And when we think about hostility in its more ordinary sense, they could just use those words: animosity, bias, disrespect. So they could just eliminate talk of hostility to religion altogether. This avoids certain ambiguities. Here are some cons. The court's probably never going to do that. That requires a certain sort of concerted effort and agreement that judges and justices rarely exhibit. Also, replacement terms. What are those going to be? They're probably going to be ambiguous too. So at this point, I'm not really sure which perspective I favor, which of the proposals, but I think they're worth getting out there. So that's what I've got. Thanks for your time.
Thank you my camera's not on. Thank you so much. Were there any questions or comments? Please raise your hand using the reaction button if you do have any questions or comments, or you can put them in the chat as well.
I have a question. I'm not sure if this is very well articulated, but do you think it matters for the court to make a distinction between the objects of hostility? So whether, so there is this term like hostility to religion, but it seems that it matters whether the object of hostility is a religious believer, the individual, or it's a religious action by some corporate body. So for example, the Baker case, it seems like the baker, the individual, is the object of hostility. Maybe I'm not interpreting that right, but that is, I mean, it is the action that is being targeted. But in your talk, you do kind of slide back and forth between belief, religious belief, and action, and then there are the individuals. So do you think in the court's, rulings, it matters whether the objects differ?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I hadn't thought of it. So, right, I was talking about how the subject might matter. And you're sort of flipping around and say, well, the object seems to matter too. And I haven't thought a whole ton about that. So here's a few thoughts. So yeah, I think there's a way, just as the courts have been sort of insensitive to how the meaning of hostility to religion might differ depending on who the subject is, they often haven't been particularly careful about thinking about who the object is. And it's often not particularly clear what exactly the object is. Who's the receiver? Who or what is the receiver of hostility? Is it Jack Phillips, the baker himself? Is it specifically his religious beliefs? Is it something like, he's a Christian, so in his case, it's something like the Christian religion or the Christian tradition? And it seems like these differences would matter. So stepping back, thinking about hostility as negative non-neutrality toward religion. The original idea, so here's a wrinkle that I didn't get into in the talk. The first usages of hostility toward religion were in Establishment Clause cases. The idea is you violate the Establishment Clause if you fail to be neutral toward religion, because you're either like sidling up too closely to religion or pushing it too far away, to sort of like use that like metaphorical language here. So the idea is the objects in the Establishment Clause cases tended to be like traditions, where the idea is you don't want to show too much favorability towards Christianity or even something more specific. You don't want to show too much favor towards the Baptists or the Episcopalians or the Jews or something like this. So in the original context, the object tended to be a faith tradition. But then the cases sort of migrated from the Establishment Clause to free exercise. So Masterpiece Cake Shop was not an Establishment Clause case, it was a free exercise case. The question was were the bakers' free exercise rights to religion violated by the law? So suddenly you've got this phrase or a set of interchangeable phrases like hostile towards religion, hostility towards religion, etc. That used to be applied where the implied object of religion was a faith tradition. Now the implied object tends to be something much more specific in the free exercise cases. It's a person or the person's beliefs or some aspect of the person's identity or something like that. And I didn't think about it before, but this actually kind of nicely explains the ambiguity I picked out between negative non-neutrality and then sort of more ordinary parlance. I think it's going to be much more natural to start using the word hostility and the phrase hostility toward religion in its natural language senses as something like animosity or ill will when you're applying it to persons or religious beliefs over a tradition. So I think, yeah, one of the frustrating things about Masterpiece was, in a way, this was a radically new application of the hostility toward religion criteria. They were saying that adjudicators had acted in a hostile fashion as part of an adjudicatory decision-making process. The phrase had never quite been used in that sort of way. So there's all sorts of questions about, well, what counts as being hostile in your actions as an adjudicator? And I think it does matter who the object is. It's kind of tricky to keep track of the moving parts, because I think what you're helping me see is it matters both what sense of hostility we're using, who the subject is, and who the object is. And there's a way in which, until we sort of like hammer down a couple of those things, it's hard to figure out the third one. But since they're all in flux, it's just a mess. It's just a real mess. So, but it's a good question. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jada.
Give me 1 second here.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. So I just had a question about whether these are really two senses or whether they're just degrees, because the negative non-neutrality, at a certain point, it becomes the animosity if you kind of put negative non-neutrality on a spectrum. And oftentimes in human relationships, our attitudes and intentions and stuff in a difficult situation get engaged to the point where it becomes animosity. But I did sort of wonder whether they're really two different senses versus just where you are on the spectrum. And when you're talking about organizations and stuff, you're naturally going to think more on one side of the spectrum. When you're talking about interpersonal relationships, you're naturally going to think more on the other side of the spectrum. But of course, you can block that. You could say, I think the chair of my department is hostile to me. And I really do think that, but I did not necessarily. I don't think Eric's here, so maybe I should. I should have checked whether he was here. But anyway, I could say he's hostile to me, and I could instantly say something like, it's not that he overtly undermines me in front of people, but I put in requests and they're just like not approved, and I feel like other people, so I feel like you could kind of explain what you mean by hostile in a way where it doesn't feel like you're shifting, but you're just sort of explaining where it is along that spectrum.
Yeah. This is a really good question and set of thoughts. Thank you. So I'll start kind of with this last bit. So part of why I had to sort of rethink my original proposal in a previous paper was something like this. The court is using the word hostility in two distinct senses, one just meaning negative non-neutrality, the other one meaning animosity. These are, the one is semi-stipulative, the other is the ordinary language meaning of hostility. What do we mean when we say someone's being hostile? We mean they're showing animus. But then, I started thinking about the hostile work environment cases. And I was thinking about how hostility is used in a number of other legal cases, including in sexual harassment cases, thinking about in the workplace. And it seems to me, I don't want to say that one's being hostile in those situations only if one's exhibiting animosity or something like that. Hostile work environments can exist when no person is exhibiting ill will or animosity. So I need to find some sort of account that doesn't delegitimize that genuine sense of hostility. So that's the first part. I sort of want to recognize that my picture doesn't work if it can't accommodate the sort of things we were talking about, where someone's saying I feel like my workplace is hostile. It's not that I think anyone hates me or has it out for me, but this is not an environment in which I can flourish for various sort of systemic or institutional reasons. So that's the first part. So the second part of my response is, okay, then how should we conceptualize the meaning of hostility? One option would be to say it's univocal and there's some sort of spectrum. So that's the proposal you're offering. I think that perspective makes most sense from someone who is keen to keep the definition of hostility as something like negative non-neutrality. Because that's a broad conception of hostility. And then what that person says is, sure, yeah, the reason why I can say, hey, animus, animosity, lack of flourishing, all these sorts of things constitute hostility is because they're all types of negative non-neutrality. So if you want to use that expansive conception of what hostility is, you can sort of explain all the other cases in a way that's not best explained as ambiguous use, but rather more specific uses or stronger uses or something further on the spectrum. Here's the worry I have about that. So let's say that this is a bit of like a toy example, but I think it'll work. So let's say my dentist has a policy that says anyone who is more than 15 minutes late to an appointment won't be seen. So I'm running late. I know I'm going to be more than 15 minutes late to the dentist. I call the office and I say, oh, sorry. I'm actually not going to keep that example. I was using that for a different purpose. I'm going to back up. Let's do something else. So here's the issue. Sometimes someone can not be treated in a neutral fashion. And it seems sort of like non-systemically accidental with no one's ill will. So think about a case where like is sort of like a one-off failure. So let's say you applied, I don't know how good this example is. Let's say you applied for something and there was a bunch of applicants and your application was the last paper in the stack. And someone picks up the papers and they forget to bring yours. So there's an initial conversation where people are thinking about their top candidates. People sort of get attached to certain sort of candidates. And then they realize, oh no, we've forgotten one person. We need to restart the conversation, try to bring them in. But it just doesn't, people, despite their best wishes, had already formed preferences. And like on that one occasion, you don't get it. You might have gotten it actually if you hadn't been that last person in the pile. So there's a way in which like in that adjudication, you haven't been treated neutrally. And I think there's a way in which people are maybe even blameworthy for that. But it doesn't seem like there's any way in which anyone behaved in a hostile manner towards you. It'd be one thing if like women were at the bottom of the pile and they're always at the bottom of the pile. And so there's this systemic thing where this keeps happening to you. It'd be another thing if someone was like out to get you in the room, and the fact that you got brought in late is like a great reason to sort of like push you aside or something like that. So my worry is that sort of, I don't want to say harmless because there was still harm done in that case, but sort of like blameless or like blame light cases, or at least we're calling you hostile is the wrong kind of blame.
Can I have a quick finger on this, just really, really fast, because I want other people to have a chance. It doesn't seem wrong to me to say that people were hostile to my application. I think the reason it sounds wrong to say that they're hostile to me is they don't really know me personally. And it's not any of my traits, like I'm a woman or, you know, I'm this age or something like that. But it doesn't sound wrong to me to say that they were hostile to my application. So maybe the object thing that Catherine was bringing up is relevant here. It does sound wrong to say hostile to me because they don't really know me and it's not about any features of me. It's just that I happen to be the last application. It could have been anyone, which is why it sounds wrong to say they're hostile to me. Because the contrast class means as opposed to other people. But it does seem right to say they're hostile to my application. Any application in the last part would have, the last one, they would have reacted the same to. And so maybe it's worth thinking about whether you think it's right to say that they're hostile to your application. To me, that actually does sound right.
Okay,
so
yeah. Thank you for that. Because I think, I'm not sure I have the same intuition about hostile to the application. So it's good, I agree that in that scenario, it makes more sense to me to say that they were hostile to your application than that they were hostile to you.
Right.
That wouldn't have felt like a supernatural application of the concept to me. But I think in part because even if hostility is not ambiguous, it seems like there is some sort of semantic indeterminacy or semantic underdetermination in play. Because if it ends up being like some sort of like spectrum concept, like maybe at what point you're off the spectrum differs. So there's some sort of like linguistic open-endedness going on. And I think it's worth trying to tease out the best way to explain that sort of linguistic open-endedness. But I think you're pressing me in a good direction to think about the semantic mechanism being something like vagueness, or just a different form of semantic underdeterminacy rather than ambiguity. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks.
Were there any additional questions? Okay.
Mark, you have us all thinking very carefully about indeterminacy, and so I was hoping that you will continue the story about running late to the dentist, because I often do that, and I wanted to see what kind of excuse I get, but I think you backed away from that.
I could still give the example. So the reason why I backed away is because I realized the dentist example was going to hinge on how one conceptualized neutrality rather than hostility. So here's the thing I was thinking about. You go to the dentist, you're going to be more than 15 minutes late. You give them a call and say, please, can you make an exception to the policy? And they say, no, sorry, tough luck, reschedule. So that's a bummer. It might not feel very nice, but so long as that's what they do anytime someone gives a call, at the very least, it seems like they're being neutral, right? There's a neutral application of the policy. So what I was thinking there was sort of two things. One, the way in which neutrality can sort of like, well, I don't want to say that the dentist office was hostile to me, right? And Justice Kennedy, though, says sometimes if you fail to accommodate someone, or if you fail to be accommodating, this seems like latent hostility. So I want to say, no, I don't think this was latent hostility by the case of my dentist office or non-neutrality, even though it was a failure to accommodate me. So the reason I stopped was I realized it would have been more informative to say something about neutrality than it would have about hostility. But maybe people have differing intuitions about the nature of whether or not my dentist behaves in a hostile fashion. And they say, no, this is our policy. I say, I'm just going to be 16 minutes late. And they say, no, tough luck. I don't know.
Suppose now I had, on a previous visit to the dentist, I was waiting in the waiting room, and somebody called, and I was within earshot, and that person was running late, and the clerk said, all right, you're 5 minutes late. Okay, come on in. That's okay. All right. And then I called in my case, I'm running 5 minutes late with the expectation that that the same kind of accommodation would be extended to me. And I was told, no, I'm sorry, we have a policy if you're this late, so you're late. And I can say, and then at a further time when I visited the dentist, I said, I should have come to this appointment at this particular time, but I was running 5 minutes late, and this is what happened to me. But I had experience while I was waiting in the waiting room on a previous occasion that you were more lenient. And he said, well, it depends on who answered the phone. I mean, there were different people, different clerks have different personalities, and maybe it was this one. So it was not, don't take it personally, it's that kind of person. So what do I do? I mean, was I being treated unjustly or not?
Yeah, that's a great example, because I think it sort of like helps tease apart to what extent we might want to say the dentist's office, sort of like as a collective agent. I think I want to say your dentists, like the office, treated you both non-neutrally, and you might say with some hostility. Like you just heard someone else get this break, yet the office isn't going to give you the break. So it's clear they haven't, it's clear they're not neutrally enforcing their policy. And I think to the extent that we want people to neutrally enforce policies, this is some sort of injustice. Whether or not it's hostile, right? So the detail you added that it's sort of like different receptionists and there's sort of like different personalities and preferences. This seems to sort of like undercut the feeling that it was hostile. If person A just always says no and doesn't accommodate any requests, that person A is behaving in a neutral fashion. And maybe because person A is behaving in a neutral fashion, that's why we feel like the office isn't being hostile. You just sort of got a bad break because you got the grumpy receptionist, right? But it still seems like we can impute a certain sort of like unfairness and injustice to the level of like the practice as a whole. It might have a responsibility to make sure that its receptionists aren't doing things like this, where some people are getting breaks and others aren't, particularly if they have a stated policy. But I'm not sure. So I think it's a good example of where like the fairness consideration applies to the institution. But like my inclination is to not say that your dentist's office behaved in a hostile manner to you. Maybe the particular receptionist did. So I think that's a really good test case. Thanks.
I see Josh has a question.
Yeah, sorry, I lost internet for about 5 minutes. So if you answered this question while I was gone, I'm sorry. But so in the cases that, or at least in the masterpiece case that you were talking about, it seems like hostility religion has sort of been used for conservative purposes and often seems to mean something more like hostility to Christianity. I was wondering if there are cases where it's been used more progressively against, say, like Islamophobic policies and laws.
Yeah, so there are examples where the concept of hostility of religion has been used to protect religious minorities. So the 1993 case, Lukumi Babalu I v. Hialeah, the city of Hialeah basically didn't want a Santeria place of worship in town. So they came up with like this kind of jerry-rigged rule about how you could slaughter animals that would allow the Santeria to not engage in any sort of like ritualistic sacrifice. And it was like very specifically targeted at Santeria. And you go back and you like look at the town meetings and they're saying things like, you know, we need to promote the message of Jesus Christ, not this other sort of stuff. So like a really, really clear case. So that was actually one of the first applications of hostility to religion in the free exercise context. Justice Kennedy wrote that opinion too and said, look, this is a clear violation of religious neutrality. And that was a unanimous decision. So yes, at the outlying cases, it's been used to help religious minorities, but I think the worry you raise is still a serious problem. So for example, Masterpiece Cake Shop and Trump v. Hawaii were decided within like 3 weeks of each other. So here the course, in my opinion, sort of went out of its way to craft a narrative of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission as hostile to Jack Phillips' Christian beliefs. Yet the court was unwilling to say, at least the 5 conservative justices in the majority, that Trump had behaved in a manner that was hostile towards Islam or to Muslim people, which, you know, Sotomayor took them to task for, rightly. So there definitely is a problem of sort of Christian dominionism or sort of like Christian favoritism in how these cases play out. And this is why I find what Alito did particularly troubling in the American Legion case, where he says, well, if we took down this cross, some people would perceive this as hostile to religion. I'm like, well, the people who filed the lawsuit obviously perceive the cross being up as hostile to religion. That's the whole point of this lawsuit. You've got 2 different groups that sort of perceive things differently. So I'm very wary of a sort of wishy-washy test or set of comments that Alito only looked at half of the equation. He kept referencing how, well, people would see this as hostile if we took it down now. But yes, who are those people that you're thinking about? They're Christians, and that's not the entirety of our polity. So I think both hostility of religion has been used, the concept, to help protect religious minorities, but overall its application is not it's not neutral and might be hostile, actually. So yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've come to the end of our time, and Jackie usually has a little spiel, but I want to encourage those people who are still with us consider signing up for next year's series. So we're advertising, and I'm sure that this is one of the programs that the new administration of the center would continue to have, since it has served, or people have been saying that it has served a very important purpose of bringing people from across various departments into fellowship here. So we've put out the ad, and people are signing up. So if you're available for next year, please consider signing up. Jacqueline? Right. Well, thank you so much for coming. And the center tends to provide the speaker with small gifts. We have 2 available, which we will distribute to you in due course. One is a mask with the center's logo on it, and the other is a journal that you can, with the center's logo on it, which you can use to make notes. So, Mark, if you have any closing comments, you could make them now. Otherwise, we'll just let you. Thank you all for coming.
My closing comment is just thank you, everyone, for your time, for the questions, and thanks to the center for hosting me. It's been good to be with you all.
All right.